I am Brian Hawkins, the Senior Director of External Affairs at People United for Privacy Foundation, and I will be your host for today's conversation. Today, we will discuss our recently released comprehensive report, 2025 State Threats to Donor Privacy and Nonprofit Advocacy. This report goes state by state to offer the most comprehensive analysis and forecast of actual and potential threats to nonprofit donor privacy and legislatures across the country. Our speakers today are Matt Nese, Vice President here at People United for Privacy Foundation. Many of you already know Matt, so he needs little introduction. Matt has been with PUFP since January 2022. Prior to that, he spent a decade at the Institute for Free Speech. He is a nationally renowned expert on nonprofit donor privacy and free speech issues, and he will share his wisdom with us today. Joining Matt is Paul Gessing. Paul is the president of the Rio Grande Foundation, a state-based free market think tank in New Mexico. Paul has been on the front lines to support donor privacy rights, and he will share his experiences battling a disclosure threat in New Mexico that just never seems to go away. Before we dive in, a few housekeeping notes. We will keep this conversation to a strict 30 minutes. If you have any questions, please submit them in the chat box, and we will get to them if time permits. If you have more specific or comprehensive questions, you can always reach out to Matt at matt@unitedforprivacy.com. With that, let's jump into it. Matt, for those that haven't yet digested your report, what are the top trends you're seeing in the states this legislative session?
Happy to talk about it. Hey, Brian, and thanks everyone for being here. So as Brian mentioned, the State Threat Memo looks at the 50 states. We looked at legislation that was reintroduced this year, so it's active right now. We looked at legislation that we expect to be reintroduced this year based on what happened in the last legislative session last year and the year prior. And so it kind of is a comprehensive survey. This year's memo looked at 34 states, and that's an uptick from 2024 when there were only 31 states. Not necessarily what you want to see, but it speaks to the threat that exists in state legislatures across the country for nonprofits engaged in issue advocacy and the privacy of their supporters. I think the biggest thing that's worth understanding in a post-election year like this one is that we always see an uptick in threats. I've been doing this for nearly 2 decades at this point, going on that, and this is a constant trend. And I think it's pretty easy to understand. Politicians, after a heated election season, come into office wanting to get back, so to speak, at those who have dared to criticize their voting records or their agendas, and that power goes to their heads, and they tinker with the law, or at least attempt to try to get after their critics. Of course, nonprofit donor disclosure laws affect everyone, not just the politicians' critics. But that's why we see an uptick likely this session. It's also worth noting that there are no partisan trends, for better or worse. The way the states broke down in terms of state control is that we see threats in 14 Democratic-controlled states, 14 Republican-controlled states, and 6 states with split legislatures, whether that's divided between the legislature itself or the legislature and the governor. And so that's the other very important thing to understand about this issue, is that threats are motivated by retribution more than they are ideology. Certainly ideology plays a role. There are some politicians that just seek to destroy and violate privacy for nonprofit members and supporters. And then there are others that just, like, as I said, want to get back at their critics. And then the other thing we're seeing, which I imagine we'll talk about later, is that we're starting to see, as we anticipated in years past, the expansion of a very dangerous effort in Arizona that passed via ballot measure. It's about as expansive a threat as we've seen that targets nonprofits engaged in advocacy in all forms, and not just their donors, but their donors, and that is Prop 211 in Arizona and what it terms as a original source disclosure. We're seeing that start to spread in states, not necessarily successfully yet, but certainly there are efforts. I'm sure we'll get into it, but there's certainly a lot of activity going on right now.
Awesome, man. Yeah, and you're right. We're going to dig into a lot of this throughout the conversation. But one more question for you. What are some of the red flags that the nonprofit community should be on the lookout for in some of this legislation that'll emerge throughout the states?
So it's kind of like playing whack-a-mole at times. A lot of nonprofit donor disclosure threats aren't just readily apparent. Sometimes they are, but in most bills they're not. So we look through a variety of things. Really, any legislation that's dealing with campaign finance, especially definitions. You think campaign finance, you think, oh, that's just political entities. Nonprofits aren't political entities, but that's kind of the point. Foes of privacy want to take the campaign finance statutes and expand them so that they cover activities nonprofits engage in, and that disclosure requirements applicable to political parties, political committees, candidates, then apply those to nonprofits and their supporters. So, in particular, we pay attention to legislation that touches either electioneering communication or independent expenditure statutes. Electioneering communication is a mouthful, but what that basically is, it's a term of art that explicitly covers issue advocacy. Electioneering communications are really any sort of message that doesn't express support or opposition for a candidate, but talks about a candidate. And because many candidates are themselves elected officials, that can rope in nonprofits who are engaged in advocacy on issues or legislation or a lawmaker connected to an issue, regardless of whether the nonprofit's talking about the issue in a positive way or they're critical of something that's happening. And election communications typically have disclosure requirements attached. Not all states have this, but many states do, and some of the states that don't are trying to. There are efforts to put these definitions into law. Independent expenditures are more political, but the danger here is that state statutes aren't all the same, especially in the campaign finance realm. And so what you have are things that, the definition seems like it's political in nature, but they're twisting it so that it applies to nonprofits talking about issues, not political campaigns. So campaign finance is obviously the biggest red flag. Lobbying reform bills can same issue. There's a movement in the states to go after what they call grassroots lobbying. That is lobbying not of legislators, but talking to the public and educating the public specifically around pending legislation. There are efforts to register groups, nonprofits that do that work, and then force disclosure of their donors if they're doing it. Ethics reform bills for the same reasons. And then, in particular, this year, we're starting to see an issue for the first time where there's been a movement over the past few years with the rise of artificial intelligence to require disclaimers on very broadly worded political communications. And we're seeing in some states, harkening back to what I was just talking about, an effort to shoehorn electioneering communications definitions into that legislation that in states where that doesn't otherwise exist. And we think this is a sly maneuver to put something on the books now that they'll then expand later to target nonprofits and their donors. But I would say campaign finance, lobbying bills, ethics reform bills, and now AI disclaimer legislation are some of the biggest targets. Some bills do, of course, explicitly call for nonprofit donor disclosure, but that's less likely than more nuanced technical bills that have a dangerous impact.
Um, that's helpful, overwhelming. So I'm going to cheat a little bit. And, our call to action is if you see these things in your state, call Matt, because these things are really tricky to deal with. And Paul is actually someone who calls Matt a lot because lawmakers in New Mexico are always trying to infringe on free speech. So we're going to zoom out from the macro level, kind of dig in micro a little bit, talk about New Mexico. Paul, can you walk us through the active donor disclosure threat that's happening in New Mexico right now?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So this year is for New Mexico a 60-day legislative session, which in many states might be a short session. In New Mexico, it's our long session, which means there's plenty of opportunity for mischief on the part of New Mexico's legislators, specifically Senator Peter Wirth, who is the majority leader of New Mexico's Senate. Very progressive individual, so New Mexico's blue state. The bill number this year is SB 85. This is another effort to take away donor privacy in New Mexico. It doubles down on existing New Mexico law. by replacing the word contribution in the statute with donation. Current law defines a contribution as funds given or received for a political purpose. Therefore, an argument could be made that an organization making independent expenditures is only required to report donors who give for a political purpose, even though the context in which the existing law uses the term argues for a broader and general purpose to report all donors. SB 85 would make it explicit that donors who give for any purpose, not just political purposes, are required to report if an organization makes independent expenditures. The intent seems to be to name and shame donors to organizations that speak out about policy issues and deter nonprofits like Rio Grande Foundation and others from voicing their opinions in public debates. So this is a very real threat because of his powerful position in New Mexico's legislature, and specifically the Senate. Worth rammed this bill through on a unanimous vote in both houses, in the Senate, with no opposition. We, quite frankly, did not realize that this was a threat until a little bit too late on the Senate side. I guess the silver lining is that we've rallied the troops, and the House has not moved this particular legislation. So I believe one of the founding fathers had a quote along the lines of eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. I unfortunately, we at the Rio Grande Foundation were caught unawares on this particular proposal. And I think while we've done a lot of work to educate, especially Republicans in New Mexico on some of these issues over the near decade that we've been fighting these issues, it is one of those things I think they probably were told by the majority leader that this was the cleanup language, that this was innocuous, and they didn't realize exactly what they were voting for.
Well, so you just hinted at this, that this has been a decade-long fight in New Mexico. Talk us through, like, what's the political landscape there? What's been happening over the past 10 years that has made New Mexico just a continual battleground on this issue?
Well, I'm not going to try to disprove Matt's thesis that this is a Republican and Democrat issue. New Mexico's moved pretty quickly over the last decade to being quite progressive. We've always been a purplish, maybe blue state, depending on the situation. But really, this whole debate got rolling in New Mexico back in 2017 with the rise of Secretary of State Maggie Toulouse Oliver. She proposed and put forth a regulatory process which was designed to limit free speech in a lot of these ways. There was simultaneous legislation. We had a Republican governor, Susana Martinez, at the time, who we were able to get to veto a bill that passed both houses. At that time, the Democrats still had a majority in both houses. So they rammed a first round of campaign finance restrictions through. Existing law is requiring that any organization spending more than $3,000 on independent expenditures in connection with a non-statewide race, and more than $9,000 in connection with a statewide race, had to publicly report contribution to the organization of more than $5,000 during an election cycle. So we've actually been in litigation, thanks to the help of the Liberty Justice Center, on that previous issue, which ultimately did pass in a subsequent legislative session. So those regulations put forth by the Secretary of State were superseded by very similar legislation. So it comes up almost every session. The litigation has been quite slow, even slower than I would have expected, given my position. I believe the lawsuit was filed in 2019 after the passage of that subsequent law and signing by the new governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham, a Democrat. So, yeah, this issue is one of those that goes on and on and on and on. So Matt has a job for life, and as do you, Brian.
Paul, we'll come back to you in a second. Matt, let's go to the other side of the country. What's happening in Maine?
So I mentioned early on in my remarks, I had talked about Arizona Prop 211, which is an original source, quote unquote, disclosure initiative. That passed in obviously a red, some might say purple state in Arizona, after a deceptive campaign talking about it as a dark money measure when really it's just a measure that blanket implicates all nonprofits and any of their supporters who speak on anything happening in the state. Nevertheless, in Maine, I had mentioned this was being exported elsewhere, and that's certainly what's happening in Maine. In Maine, it's a Republican sponsor who is pushing this. Some Democrats and some Republicans are aligned. There's been a history here, not as long as New Mexico, but this bill first came up last session as LD 1590 in 2023. It was similarly kind of what happened with the New Mexico bill this year, unanimously recommended from committee. Maine works a little bit differently than New Mexico, where a lot of work is done in committees, and then the chambers, each chamber gets a up or down vote on committee recommendations. But nevertheless, the bill was unanimously recommended for passage in Maine out of committee. Same thing, deceptive. Lawmakers didn't really know what was going on. What they were told was happening wasn't really what the bill actually is doing. And then luckily, we worked with some groups in state, and there was a bipartisan push to oppose the legislation to get the committee to pull it back and reconsider it. Two groups in particular, Maine Conservation Voters and another organization, spoke out in opposition. Lawmakers rescinded their recommendation, carried over the bill to 2024, then you voted unanimously to kill the legislation. And now it's back, and very timely because the bill is back and was introduced last Thursday and has a hearing this coming Monday. It's LD 951. This, in some respects, not to say anything positive about the New Mexico effort, but this, in some respects, is far worse because it's not just one nonprofit that's implicated. It's all of the donors to your nonprofit, and any of the donors to your nonprofit are another nonprofit or group, then it's their donors that need to be reported, and it kind of goes back endlessly. It's not only a privacy nightmare, it's also a logistical and administrative nightmare. Let alone, the safety concerns of this sort of disclosure and the misleading nature of this disclosure in a very politicized environment. But this bill is just getting started in Maine. We'll have another battle on our hands. I'd emphasize again that this is being sponsored by Republican Senator Rick Bennett, and that's kind of the point, going back to what I said initially, that this type of stuff is motivated by retribution in many cases, not just ideology. It doesn't break down on party lines as neatly as it does and many other issues in the policy world.
Thank you, Matt. Just a reminder to our audience, if you have any questions, you could submit them through the Q&A chat box, and I'll get to them as they arrive. Thank you. Matt, back to you for a second. So we've talked about New Mexico, we've talked about Maine. Any other bills we should be tracking? I'm
Sadly,
sure there's
many.
quite a few.
Yeah,
Give us like
many.
one or two.
Yeah, no worries. I would direct everyone to our state threat memo. If you saw the event invite, there is a link to it in there. This documents many bills. Of course, some like the main bill, though we predicted it, weren't yet introduced. So this, can all change at any time. But I'll put things in a few buckets. So just standard nonprofit donor disclosure legislation, retribution motivated donor disclosure legislation. Two bills worth noting in Pennsylvania, House Bill 374 and House Bill 542. The former 374 is a pretty narrow, let's just apply campaign finance reporting requirements to any nonprofit. I think that's blatantly unconstitutional, but that's what the bill does. And then 542 House bill is a much broader package modeled after congressional Democrats' HR 1 legislation in Congress when they were in control of the House and the Senate, and the House subsequently they pushed legislation marked as HR 1, which is a literal smorgasbord of any anti-privacy, anti-speech provision you could find, nonprofit donor disclosure included, and that's what HB 542 is. Going back to last session, the 2023-2024 biennium in Pennsylvania, the HR 1 style package never was really heard in committee, but the other bill, which just applied campaign finance disclosure requirements on nonprofits, was passed out of committee, passed the House, including with some bipartisan support, though there was certainly some opposition. The Pennsylvania House is a very large body, but nevertheless, that bill was stalled in the Senate and didn't go anywhere. Pennsylvania has a very narrowly divided legislature with Republicans in control of the Senate by a few seats, and then a House chamber that is a 102-101 Democratic controlled, almost split. And so we expect that bill to be an effort in the House again. They're actually, the legislature is tied at the moment, waiting for a special election, but we expect that Democrats will remain control after that, and then we expect the bill will move once that election takes place at some point this year. Unlike New Mexico's 60-day session, Pennsylvania is in session nearly all year. And so this bill is going to be a threat for a while. On the original source disclosure Prop 211 style front, we talked about Maine, obviously. There were several bills in North Dakota, again, a red state, that have died thanks to opposition. One failed on the House floor, but there was a serious push for it. And then there were watching bills in Minnesota and Hawaii. The Minnesota bill in particular, I'm a bit concerned about. That's Senate File 905. Minnesota has a divided legislature as well, so perhaps that would be a roadblock, but I wouldn't be so sure. That bill hasn't had a hearing yet, but we're waiting to see if that happens. And that's, again, an original source Prop 211 style disclosure bill, very similar to the main bill that I just went through. And then I mentioned some AI type bills that sneak in electioneering communication provisions to target nonprofit issue advocacy. There's one of those, technically two of them, they're identical, on Governor Youngkin's desk in Virginia right now. That's House Bill 2479 and Senate Bill 775. And then with a similar bill in Kentucky, Senate Bill 4, it's a wide-ranging bill dealing with AI policy across various different sectors of government, and it tucks in one of these electioneering communication provisions. There was an amendment filed on the floor to strike all that language, but it wasn't voted on. That bill is rapidly nearing passage of both chambers and heading to Governor Beshear's desk, where I imagine he might sign it. And so in Kentucky and Virginia, those aren't necessarily privacy threats now. They certainly will be privacy threats. I'd put a lot of money on it next year and beyond.
Matt, I've been working with you for a long time, and I am forever impressed by your ability just to spit out bill numbers. It shows the level of depth you do into all of this. Paul, I want to get back to you for a second. So, Matt just listed off a bunch of different states. We have a lot of SPN friends or state think tanks watching this webinar right now. What, from your experience in New Mexico, what has worked with fighting these bills, and what hasn't worked?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, you've got to educate these legislators. Very few to nobody on the think tank side or in the legislatures in their respective states really gets involved in politics because they care about donor privacy or free speech. Just the reality of the situation. This is a secondary or tertiary issue for virtually all of these legislators. Certainly, while the advocate here in New Mexico, Peter Worth, is powerful and very passionate about this issue, we can educate those likely to oppose him. And maybe in New Mexico, it's unique because that does tend to be an ideological Republican contingent, although they don't have the numbers to stop anything by themselves. So once you move on to hopefully shoring up your Republicans, and again, that's not always useful, not always the case, but it is in New Mexico. So I'm talking from my experience. You've got to go to that mushy middle, and that probably is going to be a majority of your legislative body is people who don't know and don't care about this particular area of issues. Some of them will follow whoever's their leader in their political party and just do whatever they tell them to do. You've got to, try to make that political price tag real for them. Educate them first, and then try to, shame them and name them from an anti-privacy perspective. Obviously, litigation is an important arrow in your quiver as well. You want to try to avoid it in the legislative process if at all possible. But Liberty Justice Center is an organization that's really been great for us on these issues. Other donor privacy issues, because yes, we deal with other unrelated or similar issues. Goldwater and their litigation team has been very helpful as well. Reaching out to philosophical opponents, groups like the ACLU in a blue state like New Mexico, they may not be willing to publicly come out in really opposition to these proposals because they are generally, at least in New Mexico, done by Democrats, but maybe they can influence those mushy middle Democrats because this is one of those cross-partisan issues that you can gain traction with some of those groups. And, obviously, I've been in this for a while. ACLU used to be a little easier organization to just give a call to. I think around the time of Donald Trump's rise to political prominence is when the ACLU became a tougher nut to crack, but they're still willing to engage on some of these issues, and labor groups and other environmental groups, et cetera, can also be engaged with. But ACLU at least has a more philosophical bent, and in New Mexico, they're very, very influential with the progressives that do dominate the state.
That's a perfect transition to one of the questions that just came in through the Q&A. So Paul, you mentioned the ACLU has been a great ally for you in New Mexico. Matt, you've mentioned some center-left partners in Maine that have been good allies. So are there other center-left groups, whether state-specific, that have been good partners on this issue? And I think, Paul, you made a good point. Some might not be as public as others, but are still willing to help. Matt, are you able to share any insights there?
Yeah, I'll be very quick given that we're almost at time. But Paul's correct about the ACLU. Their chapters operate very independently. So you need a chapter that's willing to engage or has the means to engage. But certainly they are very helpful and have been in a lot of states, especially reasoning with certain politicians that might otherwise be inclined to support these bills. Environmental groups, as we mentioned. I think Nevada is actually interesting. Right now, there's a push there to do something positive in the privacy front that we are supportive of. But at one of the bill hearings there, both Planned Parenthood and the Right to Life organization in Nevada appeared in support of the bill because they both care about the privacy of their supporters and members, understand what would happen if those members and supporters were disclosed. We've seen Planned Parenthood come out in opposition to certain things, disclosure provisions in certain states. Same with LGBTQ type groups, but also social conservatives, again, both supporting donor privacy because of the importance of the issue to their members. Same with groups on the center left, I would say, that represent victims of domestic violence. Those groups very much understand the importance of privacy and are often very helpful and supportive of these bills. And Paul mentioned labor unions as well. They can also be allies. It really is an issue that everyone cares about because everyone understands the value of privacy to their members and supporters. The problem is waking groups up who otherwise are focused on issues core to their missions to understand why this matters, what's happening, and the need to get engaged.
All right, we have about a minute and a half left. Matt, close us out with some good news. What's happening in the states or in the recent past that warrants some optimism about the landscape on donor privacy? Obviously, AFPF was a huge win. AFPF v. Bonta, the Supreme Court case from 2021. Are there other good news we should be tracking?
Yes, mentioning AFPF v. Bonta, there's an effort to codify that decision into law through model legislation that People United for Privacy Foundation supports. That has now become law in 20 states, Personal Privacy Protection Act, most recently in Colorado last year, where it passed unanimously. Previously to that, Alabama, a much different and more conservative state, passed that bill unanimously. Nebraska last year passed it unanimously as well. So politicians do understand the importance of protecting personal privacy and Americans or their constituents' privacy when they're confronted with the issue and understand it. There are also efforts underway in states like Kansas currently to actually look at their campaign finance laws, reform deficiencies, protect nonprofits engaged in issue advocacies who shouldn't constitutionally or from a policy perspective be forced to disclose as if they were political entities. And there are efforts underway in states like Kansas with a Democratic governor and a Republican-controlled legislature working together to reform their laws to that end. So despite all of this webinar mostly being about threats, there's certainly positive things happening as well, and hopefully there'll be more of that to come this session.
So we're right at 30 minutes. Paul, Matt, thank you for your time. And to our audience members, thank you for joining. Of course, if you have any questions, we're always eager and happy to help. Just reach out to any one of us here at PUFP. And with that, we're done. Thank you very much.